This iceberg catalogs belief systems by familiarity and obscurity. Placement is not a judgment of truth or legitimacy. Some entries involve disturbing or extremist material. Viewer discretion is advised. Timestamps are provided below. Copimism refers to the missionary church of Copimism, a Swedish religious movement that officially achieved government recognition as a legitimate religion in January 2012 after 3 separate application attempts. Founded by 19-year-old philosophy student Isak Gerson and Gustav Nipe in Uppsala, Sweden during autumn 2010, this digital age faith system centers on the sacred act of copying and distributing information. The church's name derives from "copy me," with practitioners believing that all information sharing through file downloads, uploads, and digital distribution constitutes a holy sacrament. Their core doctrine declares that copying information remains ethically righteous, while withholding knowledge through copyright restrictions violates the sacredness of information itself. Members gather at designated interaction points identified by the presence of the Holy Kopimi Pyramid, a triangular symbol containing the letter K. Spiritual leaders called operators perform initiation ceremonies where new members must share the sacred symbol and recite the phrase, "copied and seeded." These operators receive strict instructions to encrypt all virtual religious meetings due to what they term society's vicious legislative and litigious persecution of copimists. The movement emerged directly from Sweden's Pirate Byron Collective, the same group responsible for creating the Pirate Bay torrent site. This connection sparked considerable controversy when Swedish media dismissed the religious application as merely a political adventure and a devaluation of religion. Both founders maintained extensive backgrounds in online activism within Sweden's file-sharing underground. According to church doctrine, private software code and anti-piracy measures represent forms comparable to slavery. The faith promotes what members describe as cybernetic spirituality, where individual selfhood dissolves into a collective hive mind that continuously assimilates and remixes information. Their manifesto emphasizes that communication itself holds sacred properties, positioning the movement as humanity's evolution toward complete information transparency. The church has established branches across 18 countries, with over 3,500 Facebook followers and thousands more practitioners engaging in their primary ritual of file sharing. The Swedish government's official recognition granted Copimism the same legal protections and tax benefits afforded to traditional religious organizations, marking the first time authorities acknowledged a digitally native faith system rooted in internet culture.
Like this video and subscribe to Maker.
Silenkoism is a modern Ukrainian religious movement founded by Lev Silenko in 1964, built around the idea that Ukrainians don't need Christianity, Islam, or any other imported faith, because they already had a perfectly good spiritual tradition before any of those showed up. Silenko, a poet, philosopher, and former political exile, developed a belief system he called Run Vira, which stands for the native Ukrainian national faith. At its core, the religion teaches that the ancient pre-Christian spiritual heritage of Ukraine was deliberately suppressed, first by Byzantine missionaries, then by centuries of foreign domination, and that reclaiming it is essential to Ukrainian identity and survival as a people. The central text is a massive work called the Mahavira, which Silenko wrote as a kind of national scripture. It blends Ukrainian folklore, pre-Christian Slavic cosmology, and Silenko's own philosophical ideas into a unified spiritual framework. The book positions the sun and natural forces as objects of reverence, rejects the concept of original sin, and argues that Ukrainians should look inward to their own ancestral roots, rather than outward to religions born in the Middle East. Followers practice seasonal rituals tied to solstices, equinoxes, and traditional Ukrainian agricultural cycles, many of which predate Christianity by centuries, but survived in folk traditions even after forced conversion. Weddings, naming ceremonies, and funerals all follow distinctly non-Christian formats. Now, the movement has always been controversial on multiple fronts. Orthodox Christian institutions in Ukraine have condemned it as neo-pagan heresy. Critics from the academic world have accused Silenko of romanticizing and selectively reconstructing a past that may not have existed in the way he described. And some outside observers have raised concerns about the ethno-nationalist undercurrents in a religion that ties spiritual identity so tightly to ethnic heritage. Silenko himself spent much of his life in the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada and the United States, where the movement actually gained its strongest early foothold among emigrant communities desperate to maintain cultural identity far from home. After Ukrainian independence in 1991, Runvira began spreading back into Ukraine itself, where it found a receptive audience among people looking for spiritual alternatives that felt distinctly Ukrainian rather than Russian Orthodox. The movement remains relatively small but surprisingly persistent, with active temples and communities in North America and Ukraine to this day. It occupies this fascinating middle ground between genuine religious revival, cultural preservation project, and nationalist philosophy, which is exactly the kind of combination that tends to make everyone a little uncomfortable for entirely different reasons. Kandybism is a form of Slavic neopaganism founded in 1992 in St. Petersburg, Russia, by a psychologist and self-proclaimed esotericist named Viktor Mikhailovich Kandyba, along with his son Dmitry. Within the movement, Viktor is referred to as Prophet Kandyba, which should immediately set the tone for what we're dealing with here. Viktor Kandyba grew up in the Soviet Union under state-enforced atheism, attended a naval school, and later graduated in psychology. In the late 1980s, he and his son became well known in Russia for their work on what they called the culture of trance and the practice of hypnosis, which they claimed were unbroken traditions of ancient Russian Vedism. Viktor also claimed to be a direct descendant of an ancient line of Russian priests he called Vedic ideologists, or samans. In the 1990s, Kandyba formalized his belief system into what he called the Russian religion, laying it all out in his 1997 book, History of the Russian Empire. The theology is monotheistic but deeply tied to what Kandyba framed as a uniquely Russian spiritual identity. In his cosmology, the word Russian does not refer to an ethnicity. It is used as a synonym for Aryan, and it identifies a spiritual lineage tracing back to an ancient Arctic homeland. The belief system teaches that God exists as a trinity: the Father God, who is the primordial void and supreme consciousness; the Mother Goddess of the lights, who is the spiritual movement and manifested dimension; and the Sun God, called who is essentially electromagnetic radiation generated by the other two. Then fathered Ori, the first so-called God-man, who gave cosmic knowledge to humanity and became the ancestor of all Aryans, or in Kandyba's framework, all Russians. One of the more unusual aspects of the doctrine is its spiritual geography. Good and evil are mapped onto compass directions. The north and east are associated with spirituality, light, and purity. The south and west are associated with materialism, darkness, and corruption. There is an eternal cosmic struggle between these poles, with the southern and western forces constantly trying to corrupt the northern and eastern spiritual entities. Scholars have described Kandybism as highly eclectic, drawing comparisons to Zoroastrian dualism, Helena Blavatsky's theosophy, and even German Ariosophy. Kandyba rejected the need for any kind of organized church, teaching that there is a direct link between humanity and God, so no mediating structures like a priesthood or hierarchy are necessary. He also argued that the Russian religion was the foundation of all later historical religions, and that even the original teachings of Jesus aligned with his doctrine before being distorted by the compilers of the Bible, who he said introduced concepts like sin and atoning sacrifice that were never part of the original message. So to recap, a Soviet-trained psychologist and hypnotist claims descent from ancient priests, builds a religion around the idea that Russians are a chosen spiritual people descended from god-men in the Arctic, maps morality onto a compass, and says every major religion is just a corrupted version of his. That is Kandybism. Rational culture is a Brazilian religious movement that emerged in 1935 when a former military man and guitarist named Manuel Jacinto Coelho began writing what would become one of the most ambitious spiritual texts ever attempted. The work, titled Universe in Disenchantment, spans over 1,000 volumes, and claims to have been dictated to Coelho by an entity called the Rational Superior, a supreme being whose reasoning supposedly transcends all other forms of intelligence. Coelho spent 55 years writing it, finishing just shortly before his passing in 1991. The movement grew out of Umbanda, one of Brazil's Afro-Brazilian spiritual traditions, but deliberately distanced itself from those roots. During the early 20th century, practitioners of Afro-Brazilian religions faced heavy persecution from police and mainstream Brazilian society. To gain legitimacy, some groups rebranded under the umbrella of what they called high spiritism, presenting their teachings as more intellectual and refined. Rational culture took this a step further by insisting that salvation, or what they call rational immunization, could only be achieved through one method: reading all of the books, sequentially, every single volume. The cosmology itself is layered. According to the teachings, reality is divided into 4 planes. At the top sits the rational world, inhabited by pure rational beings composed of clean, perfect energy. Below that is the higher astral, home to beings who never fully developed their reasoning and who allegedly manifest as flying saucers. Then there's the lower astral, and finally the terrestrial astral, which is where we are now. So yes, this is also a UFO religion. The flying saucers are not aliens in the traditional sense, but rather spiritually incomplete entities stuck in a cosmic middle ground. The movement might have stayed relatively obscure if not for one person: Tim Maia. In 1974, Maia was already one of the biggest names in Brazilian music, a funk and soul legend with a string of classic albums. One day, while waiting for a friend to finish using the bathroom, he picked up a copy of Universe in Disenchantment off a table. Within days, the book had consumed his entire worldview. He visited Coelho's compound and later described it as something resembling an Umbanda center complete with what he called a motel for extraterrestrials. Maia went all in. He forced his band members to convert, made them give away their personal possessions, and had them paint all their instruments white. He then scrapped the lyrics for his upcoming album and rewrote everything to reflect rational culture's teachings. The result was a series of albums titled Rational, Volumes 1 through 3. At the time, the pivot baffled fans and industry insiders alike. Decades later, though, those albums became critically acclaimed cult classics, regarded as some of the most unique recordings in Brazilian music history. The movement still operates today out of its headquarters in Nova Iguaçu, near Rio de Janeiro, and maintains musical bands across 14 Brazilian states that perform as promotional tools for the books. They even launched a symphony orchestra in 2016. The whole operation is technically non-profit, with the stated goal of spreading Universe in Disenchantment to the world. Though it's worth noting that achieving spiritual salvation does require purchasing and reading every volume, which is a business model that's either divinely inspired or extremely clever, depending on your perspective. The Urantia Book is a 2,097-page text that claims to be authored not by any human, but by a collection of celestial beings who transmitted their knowledge through an unnamed human contact in Chicago during the early 20th century. The book arrived through a process that even its earliest supporters struggled to fully explain, allegedly involving a sleeping subject who would channel written material without any conscious awareness of doing so. The text itself is staggeringly ambitious in scope. It presents an entire cosmology where our planet, called Urantia in the book's terminology, is just one of millions of inhabited worlds governed by a vast hierarchy of divine administrators, angels, and spiritual beings, all operating under a single universal father. It describes the structure of the universe in almost bureaucratic detail, complete with organizational charts of celestial governance that read like a corporate flowchart for reality itself. One of the more fascinating sections is a complete retelling of the life of Jesus, spanning over 700 pages, far longer than any single gospel account. In this version, Jesus is identified as Michael of Nebadon, a creator-son responsible for an entire local universe, who chose to incarnate on Earth as part of a series of bestowals across different worlds. This section fills in the so-called missing years of Jesus' life with extremely specific details about his travels, his inner thoughts, and even his sense of humor. The book was brought to public attention largely through the efforts of Dr. William Sadler, a respected Chicago psychiatrist who had spent years debunking psychic phenomena before encountering the sleeping subject. Sadler initially approached the situation as a skeptic, but over time became convinced the material was genuinely beyond human authorship. He organized a small group called the Forum, which would submit questions that the celestial authors would then answer in subsequent papers. The Urantia Foundation published the book in 1955, and it has since sold over 1 million copies. Its readers generally resist calling it a religion, preferring to see it as a revelation that enhances existing faiths rather than replacing them. There are no clergy, no churches in the traditional sense, and no required rituals. Study groups meet in living rooms around the world, quietly working through its dense cosmological framework one paper at a time. Critics have pointed out similarities between certain passages and the works of early 20th century authors, suggesting the material may have human origins after all. Supporters counter that the celestial authors openly acknowledged using human concepts and language as building blocks for higher truths. Either way, the sheer internal consistency across its thousands of pages remains one of the most genuinely puzzling aspects of the text, regardless of where you believe it came from. Haruhiism is a semi-ironic internet religion built around the worship of Haruhi Suzumiya, the titular character from the anime series, The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya. And to understand why anyone would build a belief system around a fictional schoolgirl, you need to understand the premise of the show itself. In the series, Haruhi Suzumiya is, for all intents and purposes, God. She has the unconscious ability to reshape reality, create closed dimensions, and potentially destroy and recreate the entire universe on a whim. The catch is, she has no idea she can do any of this. The entire plot revolves around a secret group of time travelers, espers, and aliens all working together to keep Haruhi entertained and emotionally stable, because if she ever gets bored or upset enough, she could simply unmake existence without even realizing it. Fans took this concept and ran with it. Haruhiism emerged in the mid-2000s across forums, and eventually established its own dedicated communities, complete with doctrines, prayers, and a surprisingly detailed theological framework. The central tenet is simple: Haruhi Suzumiya is the one true God, and spreading awareness of her divinity is a sacred duty. Now, the obvious assumption is that this is entirely a joke, and for many participants, it absolutely is. But the line between ironic devotion and genuine spiritual practice gets blurry in ways that are hard to pin down. Some adherents have described the practice as personally meaningful, treating it as a form of meditation, or a framework for thinking about consciousness and reality. Others have pointed out that if you genuinely believe the universe could be the unconscious creation of an unaware deity, the theology is no less falsifiable than plenty of established belief systems. The movement even produced its own schisms. Debates broke out over whether Haruhi should be worshipped directly, or whether the focus should be on the concept she embodies: an indifferent, unknowing creator. That is a theological argument that mirrors real debates in deism and pantheism, which is either deeply impressive or deeply concerning depending on your perspective. Ambundu Mythology belongs to one of the largest ethnic groups in Angola, the Ambundu people, and their traditional belief system is far more layered than most Western audiences ever get exposed to. The Ambundu cosmology centers on a supreme creator deity called Nzambi Ampungu, who sits at the top of a spiritual hierarchy, but remains largely distant from human affairs. Day-to-day spiritual life instead revolves around the veneration of ancestors and a rich cast of spirits that inhabit the natural world. The ancestors aren't just remembered fondly, they're considered active participants in the lives of the living, capable of offering protection, sending warnings, or even punishing those who neglect their obligations to the family lineage. One of the most fascinating elements is the role of the Kulundu, which are spirits that can possess individuals and grant them abilities tied to divination and healing. A person chosen by a Kulundu doesn't exactly volunteer for the job. The spirit selects them, often through illness or strange behavioral changes, and the community recognizes this as a spiritual calling rather than something to be treated or suppressed. The Ambundu also have an elaborate oral tradition built around figures like Sudika Mbambi, a legendary hero born through supernatural circumstances who battles monsters and navigates the underworld. These aren't just bedtime stories. They function as encoded moral and spiritual teachings passed down across generations without ever being written down, which makes the survival of these narratives across centuries of colonialism genuinely remarkable. Portuguese colonization and the spread of Christianity hit Mbundu spiritual practices hard. Missionaries actively suppressed traditional rituals and reclassified ancestral spirits as demonic entities. But rather than disappearing entirely, many Mbundu beliefs fused with Catholic imagery and practice, creating syncretic traditions where saints doubled as stand-ins for ancestral spirits and church attendance coexisted with traditional ceremonies held in private. This blending didn't happen by accident. It was a survival strategy. And elements of Mbundu spirituality didn't just persist in Angola. They traveled across the Atlantic through the slave trade and became foundational influences on religions like Candomblé in Brazil and various other Afro-diasporic traditions throughout the Americas. So when people encounter those belief systems today, they're often engaging with echoes of Mbundu cosmology without ever realizing it. The Higher Life movement is a Christian theological tradition that emerged in the late 1800s, rooted in the idea that believers could achieve a second, deeper experience of sanctification beyond their initial conversion. Not just being saved, but reaching a state of spiritual perfection while still alive. The movement traces back to figures like William Edwin Boardman and Robert Pearsall Smith, who promoted the concept through massive religious conventions. The most famous of these was the Keswick Convention, first held in 1875 in England's Lake District, which became so influential that the theology itself is sometimes just called Keswick theology. The core claim was bold. Believers didn't have to struggle with sin for the rest of their lives. Through total surrender and faith, they could enter a higher life where the power of sin was effectively broken. Not sinlessness exactly, but a kind of continuous victory over temptation that most mainstream Protestant churches considered, at best, wildly optimistic. Robert Pearsall Smith was actually one of the movement's biggest cautionary tales. At the height of his fame as a higher life preacher, he was quietly removed from ministry after allegations of inappropriate conduct with female followers during private spiritual counseling sessions. His wife Hannah Whittle Smith continued on as a respected author, but Robert essentially vanished from public life. The movement fed directly into several later developments in Christianity. The Holiness movement, early Pentecostalism, and even parts of the modern charismatic tradition all borrowed heavily from higher life theology. That idea of a second blessing, a dramatic spiritual upgrade after conversion, became the template for speaking in tongues and other gifts of the Spirit in Pentecostal churches. Critics within Christianity have long argued that the higher life movement set people up for devastating spiritual crashes. If you're told total victory over sin is available right now, and you still struggle, the conclusion you're likely to reach is that something is fundamentally wrong with you rather than with the theology. Some scholars have linked this framework to cycles of extreme guilt and emotional burnout among devoted followers who simply could not live up to an impossible standard. Ghost dance refers to a spiritual movement that swept through Native American tribes in the late 1800s, and the United States government found it so threatening that it contributed directly to one of the most tragic massacres in American history. The movement began with a Paiute holy man named Wovoka, who in 1889 experienced a vision during a solar eclipse. He claimed to have been taken to the spirit world, where he received a message from the Creator. If Native people lived righteously, performed a specific ceremonial circle dance, and rejected the ways of white settlers, the dead would rise, the buffalo would return, and the earth would be renewed. A paradise, essentially, built on the bones of a dying world. The dance itself was performed in large circles, sometimes for days at a stretch, until participants fell into trance states and reported visions of deceased loved ones. It spread rapidly across dozens of tribes, each adapting the teachings to fit their own traditions. Among the Lakota Sioux, a variation emerged that incorporated the idea of ghost shirts, garments believed to be impervious to bullets. That detail alarmed federal authorities significantly. To the U.S. government and military, a religious movement promising bulletproof clothing and the resurrection of a pre-colonial world looked a lot like preparation for armed uprising. Indian agents began reporting hysteria. Newspapers ran sensational headlines. Sitting Bull, one of the most prominent Lakota leaders, was arrested in connection with the movement and killed during the confrontation. 2 weeks later, on December 29, 1890, soldiers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment intercepted a band of Lakota led by Chief Spotted Elk near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. What began as a disarmament operation ended with somewhere between 250 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children dead in the snow. 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for the engagement. The ghost dance effectively died at Wounded Knee. A peaceful, prophetic religious movement had been interpreted as an existential threat, and the response was a massacre. Wovoka lived until 1932. He spent his later years largely in obscurity, occasionally visited by journalists and researchers, insisting to the end that his original message had been one of peace and that the violence was a distortion of everything he had taught. The movement has seen a quiet resurgence in modern indigenous communities, less as a literal prophecy and more as a symbol of cultural survival and resistance. The shirts are still made, the circle is still danced. Collyridianism was an ancient Christian sect that took their devotion to the Virgin Mary so far that mainstream Christianity branded them heretics. Active between the 4th and 6th centuries AD, these believers primarily operated in Arabia and Thrace, where they developed worship practices that crossed the line from veneration into outright goddess worship. The group gets its name from Collyris, a type of twisted bread or small cake that formed the centerpiece of their ritual offerings. Every ceremony involved baking these special breads and presenting them to Mary as if she were a pagan deity. The practice directly mirrored how ancient cultures offered cakes and bread to goddesses like Ishtar or Astarte. What made the Collyridians particularly controversial was their treatment of Mary as a divine figure worthy of direct worship, rather than simply honoring her as the mother of Christ. They established a priesthood composed entirely of women, who would conduct elaborate ceremonies where participants would genuflect before images of Mary and present their bread offerings with the same reverence typically reserved for God himself. The sect found its strongest foothold in Arabian communities, where pre-Christian goddess worship traditions remained culturally embedded. Local women especially embraced Collyridianism, as it elevated feminine divinity in ways that Orthodox Christianity explicitly rejected. Church Father Epiphanius of Salamis documented their practices in his work Panarion, describing how they decorated their worship spaces with images of Mary adorned like ancient goddesses. He noted their belief that Mary deserved the same worship as the Father and Son, making her an equal member of what they essentially viewed as a divine trinity. The movement eventually died out as Byzantine Christianity consolidated power and stamped out what it considered dangerous deviations from Orthodox doctrine. Bogomilism was a medieval dualist religious movement that emerged in Bulgaria around the 10th century, and it quietly became one of the most subversive spiritual forces in the entire history of Christianity. The name itself comes from a Bulgarian priest named Bogomil, which translates roughly to "beloved of God." Whether that was his actual name or a title given to him by followers is still debated, but either way, the man managed to light a fuse that burned across Europe for centuries. At its core, Bogomilism taught that the material world was not created by the good God of the New Testament, but by a lesser evil deity, sometimes identified as Satan, sometimes as a kind of fallen divine being called Satanael. The idea was that everything physical, your body, the earth, the church building you were sitting in, was essentially a prison constructed by a malevolent force. The true God existed only in the spiritual realm, completely separate from this corrupt material creation. This put Bogomils in direct conflict with the Orthodox Church, because if the material world is evil, then the Church's rituals, its icons, its sacraments, its entire physical infrastructure are all tools of the enemy. Bogomils rejected baptism, the Eucharist, the cross, and veneration of saints. They believed the Orthodox clergy were servants of the demiurge whether they knew it or not. Their actual practices were strikingly austere. The inner circle, known as the perfect, abstained from meat, wine, marriage, and all physical pleasures. They owned nothing, traveled in pairs, and spent their time teaching. The broader lay followers lived more normal lives, but were expected to work toward that same ideal of detachment from the material. What made the movement genuinely dangerous to established power was its social dimension. Bogomils taught that secular authority, feudal lords, the boyar class, even the Bulgarian Tsar himself, derived their power from the evil principle rather than divine right. That is not a subtle political statement for the 10th century. That is a direct theological argument for why you do not have to obey your rulers. The movement spread west through the Balkans and into Byzantine territories, and its influence almost certainly fed into the Cathar movement in southern France, which the Catholic Church eventually crushed in one of the most brutal military campaigns of the Middle Ages, the Albigensian Crusade. The theological DNA is unmistakable between the two groups. Both believed in a cosmic dualism between good and evil creators. Both rejected the material world and its institutions. Both had an inner elite of the spiritually perfected, surrounded by ordinary adherents. Scholars still debate exactly how direct the transmission was, but the parallels are far too precise to be coincidence. Bogomilism was officially condemned repeatedly by church councils, and its followers were subject to persecution, exile, and execution across several centuries. Despite this, the movement persisted in Bosnia well into the 13th and 14th centuries, with Bosnian nobles using it as a kind of theological shield against both Roman Catholic and Orthodox pressure from neighboring powers. The Bosnian Church, which historians still argue about intensely, may have been a direct institutional descendant of Bogomil communities. Some of the large medieval tombstones scattered across the Bosnian countryside, called steci, are associated with this period and remain one of the more haunting physical remnants of the entire tradition. What gets overlooked is how philosophically sophisticated Bogomilism actually was. It was not just folk superstition dressed up in Christian language. It engaged seriously with the problem of evil, the nature of matter, and the reliability of institutional religion in a way that mainstream theology spent considerable energy trying to counter. The official responses to it produced some of the more interesting polemical texts of the medieval period, precisely because the questions it raised were not easy to dismiss. Melanesian mythology covers the spiritual traditions of a region that doesn't get nearly enough attention. The islands stretching from Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands down through Vanuatu and Fiji. What sets Melanesian belief systems apart from other mythological traditions is how intensely practical they are. These aren't abstract cosmologies about distant gods sitting in the sky. The spiritual world in Melanesian thought is immediate, present, and constantly interfering with everyday life. Ancestors don't retire after death. They stay active, influencing harvests, health, and the outcomes of conflicts. Keeping them happy isn't a metaphor. It's a survival strategy. Central to almost all Melanesian traditions is the concept of mana, a term that has unfortunately been watered down into video game slang, but originally described a very specific kind of impersonal supernatural force. Mana could reside in people, objects, or places, and its presence explained why certain individuals seem to have extraordinary luck, skill, or authority. A chief with high mana wasn't just respected. He was considered to be operating on a different energetic level than ordinary people. Spirits known as Masalai in Papua New Guinea occupy specific locations, certain trees, rivers, or stretches of coastline, and crossing into their territory without the right rituals could bring illness or misfortune. There are entire maps of these territories passed down through generations, invisible boundaries that outsiders would never know existed. One of the more striking elements is the role of secret societies, particularly in Vanuatu, where grade societies like the Nimanki system required men to climb through elaborate ritual ranks over the course of their entire lives. Each rank involved increasingly esoteric knowledge, significant wealth transfers, and ceremonies that non-members were absolutely forbidden from witnessing. The mythology also contains some of the most vivid trickster figures in any world tradition. Cat, a spirit being from the Banks Islands, is credited with creating humans, animals, and even night itself, which he reportedly had to go and purchase from a neighboring island because his people had never experienced darkness before. The Prince Philip movement is one of the more unexpected religious phenomena of the 20th century, a cargo cult from the island of Tana in Vanuatu, a small island nation in the South Pacific, whose followers came to venerate Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, as a divine being. To understand how this happened, you need a little background on cargo cults in general. These are religious movements that emerged primarily in Melanesia during and after World War II, when indigenous islanders witnessed massive quantities of goods, food, weapons, medicine, machinery, arriving seemingly from nowhere via foreign ships and aircraft. Many islanders concluded that these goods were gifts from ancestral spirits, and that the Europeans had somehow intercepted them. Cargo cults developed rituals designed to attract these goods directly, sometimes building mock airstrips or warehouses to invite the bounty. The people of Tana already had a tradition tied to this framework, a belief in a pale-skinned son of their mountain spirit deity, who had traveled across the seas, married a powerful woman, and would one day return. When word spread of the British royal family, and specifically of Prince Philip, a tall, fair man who had indeed sailed the world and married the most powerful woman in Britain, the pieces clicked together in a way that felt, to the villagers of Iacana, completely coherent. The movement grew through the 1960s and strengthened after a royal visit to Vanuatu in 1974, during which villagers reportedly caught a distant glimpse of Philip aboard a ship. This was enough. British officials, aware of the belief, quietly arranged for Philip to receive a traditional pig-killing club called a nal nal from the community. Philip was photographed holding it, and the photo was sent back to Tana. The villagers then sent back a photo of their own, requesting one of Philip holding the club. He obliged. This exchange of photographs became something close to sacred correspondence. The movement's most prominent elder, a man named Chief Jack Naiva, claimed to have paddled out to meet the royal yacht during that 1974 visit, locking eyes with Philip and knowing immediately that this was their man. When Philip passed away in April 2021, the community mourned deeply. But consistent with how these belief systems handle such events, many followers did not abandon their faith. Some concluded that Philip had simply transitioned to the spirit world, and that his power had been passed on, potentially to his son Prince Charles, though this remains a point of disagreement within the community. What makes this story genuinely remarkable is that the British royal family knew about it, played along with quiet dignity, and maintained a respectful correspondence for decades. Philip himself reportedly found the whole thing rather touching. The Native American Church, sometimes called the Peyote Church, operates as one of the few religious organizations in the United States with legal permission to use a Schedule I controlled substance as part of their worship. The substance in question is peyote, a small spineless cactus containing the psychoactive compound mescaline. Formally incorporated in 1918, the church blends traditional indigenous spiritual practices with elements of Christianity. Members consume peyote buttons during all-night prayer ceremonies, believing the plant serves as a divine sacrament that facilitates direct communication with the Creator. The church faced decades of legal battles before the American Indian Religious Freedom Act amendments of 1994 specifically protected their ceremonial use of peyote, though only for enrolled members of federally recognized tribes. The typical ceremony follows a structured format led by a roadman, sometimes called a road chief, who guides participants through the ritual. These gatherings begin at sunset and continue until sunrise, taking place inside a teepee arranged around a crescent-shaped earthen altar. Participants sit in a circle while the roadman tends a sacred fire, passes a staff and feather for prayers, and distributes peyote buttons throughout the night. Drumming, singing, and contemplative silence fill the hours between doses. Membership requirements remain strict. The church limits participation to individuals who can prove Native American ancestry and membership in recognized tribes, though some chapters have faced internal debates about these boundaries. The estimated membership ranges between 250,000 and 400,000 people across North America. The peyote itself comes primarily from a small region of southern Texas and northern Mexico, where the cactus grows naturally. Harvesters, called peyoteros, carefully cut the crowns while leaving the roots intact for regrowth. Supply concerns have emerged in recent years as wild peyote populations decline from overharvesting and habitat loss. Romuva is the ancient polytheistic religion of the Baltic peoples, and it carries the distinction of being connected to what was arguably the last stronghold of paganism in all of medieval Europe. While most of the continent had long since converted to Christianity, Lithuania held on to its pre-Christian traditions well into the late 14th century, making it a genuine anomaly in the historical record. At the heart of the faith was a sacred sanctuary, also called Romuva, believed to have existed in what is now the Kaliningrad region of modern Russia. Ancient sources describe it as a site of enormous spiritual significance, centered around a massive oak tree that served as the axis of the entire cosmos. Within that sanctuary burned an eternal flame, tended by a dedicated class of priestesses known as the Vitalutes, figures that bear a striking resemblance to the Vestal Virgins of ancient Rome. That parallel is not accidental. Both traditions appear to draw from very old Indo-European roots. The religious structure itself revolved around a divine triad: Dievas, the sky god; Perkunas, the god of thunder and storms; and Velnius, the lord of the underworld and the dead. These three governed different aspects of existence and were reportedly represented by a single three-faced idol at the sanctuary, presided over by a high priest called the Krivis. The Teutonic Knights, a Catholic military order operating under the banner of the Northern Crusades, made it their mission to bring Christianity to the Baltic region by force. The Prussian Balts were largely conquered and absorbed by the 13th century. The Lithuanians proved far more resistant, and it wasn't until 1387 that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania formally adopted Christianity, with the ruling class leading the conversion. The folk traditions never fully disappeared, though. Elements of Romuva quietly embedded themselves into Lithuanian and Latvian cultural memory, surviving through folk songs, seasonal festivals, and rural customs that the church never managed to fully stamp out. The 20th century brought an organized revival. A movement called Romuva, founded in Lithuania in the 1960s under ethnologist Jonas Trinkūnas, worked to reconstruct the religion from historical sources, folklore, and comparative mythology. After Lithuanian independence, the movement gained formal state recognition as an official religion in 1992, making it one of the very few reconstructed indigenous European faiths to achieve that status anywhere in the world. Today, practitioners observe seasonal festivals tied to the agricultural and astronomical calendar, maintain sacred fires at gatherings, and venerate the same divine figures their ancestors did over 1,000 years ago. It sits in a genuinely rare category, a pre-Christian European tradition with an unbroken cultural thread, a documented historical foundation, and a living community practicing it right now. Midewiwin, also known as the Grand Medicine Society, is one of the most sacred and secretive spiritual institutions in North American indigenous tradition, practiced primarily among the Ojibwe, Odawa, and other Anishinaabe peoples of the Great Lakes region. At its core, Midewiwin is a ceremonial healing society, but calling it simply a medicine society undersells it significantly. Membership is earned through rigorous initiation, years of instruction, and a genuine spiritual calling. Initiates progress through a series of degrees, each one unlocking deeper layers of knowledge, ceremony, and responsibility. The number of degrees varies by community, but 4 is the most commonly cited base, with some traditions extending to 8 or beyond. The society's knowledge is encoded in a remarkable and often overlooked form of record-keeping: birch bark scrolls. These scrolls contain maps of the spirit world, healing instructions, migration histories, and ceremonial songs written in a pictographic script. Some of these scrolls are centuries old and are among the oldest surviving indigenous texts in North America. The scrolls aren't decorative. They are functional, living documents that trained members can read and interpret. Central to Midewiwin ceremony is the concept of the Mide shell, a small cowrie shell that plays a role in the initiation ritual. According to tradition, during certain rites, a shell is symbolically shot into the body of the initiate by senior members, representing the transmission of sacred power and the granting of a new spiritual life. Initiates fall, then rise again. The symbolism of death and rebirth is intentional. Practitioners are entrusted with extensive botanical and medicinal knowledge passed down through oral instruction and the scrolls themselves. This knowledge covers plant remedies, spiritual protection, and methods for navigating illness that operate on both the physical and spiritual level simultaneously. What makes Midewiwin particularly notable in a broader context is its resilience. During the colonial period, the society operated quietly and deliberately underground. Ceremonies were suppressed, practitioners were targeted, and for a long stretch of history, the tradition was practiced in secrecy just to survive. The fact that the scrolls were preserved at all is a testament to how seriously the keepers of this knowledge took their obligation. Today, Midewiwin is experiencing a revival, with communities actively reclaiming ceremony, language, and the scroll traditions. It remains closed to outsiders by design, not out of exclusion for its own sake, but because the knowledge within it is understood to carry real spiritual weight that requires proper preparation to handle. Kemetism is the modern revival of ancient Egyptian religion, and when we say revival, we mean people today are genuinely worshipping Ra, Osiris, Anubis, and the full pantheon as living, active spiritual forces, not historical curiosities. The name comes from Kemet, the ancient Egyptian word for their own land, meaning the Black Land, a reference to the dark, fertile soil left by the Nile's flooding. Practitioners use this name deliberately to distance themselves from the Hollywood version of Egypt and connect with something far older and more specific. The religion began formally re-emerging in the 1970s, with a major turning point coming in 1988, when a group called the Fellowship of Isis gained traction, though the most structured modern form came through an organization called the Kemetic Orthodox Faith, founded by a woman known as Tamara Siuda, who took the title of Nisut, essentially a modern pharaoh. She underwent a formal coronation ritual in 1993 and still leads the faith today through an institution called the House of Necher. What makes Kemetism genuinely unusual compared to other modern pagan revivals is the level of reconstructionist rigor involved. Followers don't just light candles and call it a day. There are formal initiation processes, ritual purity requirements, specific liturgical calendars tied to ancient Egyptian feast days, and a concept called Senut, a daily personal shrine ritual performed at home. The theology centers on a principle called Ma'at, which represents cosmic order, truth, and balance. Practitioners believe that maintaining Ma'at in daily life is a genuine spiritual obligation, not a metaphor. There's also significant internal debate within Kemetism about how literally to interpret ancient texts, how much Greco-Roman influence to accept or reject, and whether the gods are literal beings, archetypes, or something in between. Different branches have very different answers to these questions, which has led to a fragmented but surprisingly active global community with thousands of dedicated practitioners. La Luz del Mundo, which translates to the Light of the World, is a Mexico-based megachurch that has grown from a small regional movement into one of the largest homegrown religious organizations in the Western Hemisphere, with an estimated 5 to 12 million followers spread across 50 countries. The church was founded in 1926 in Guadalajara, Mexico, by a man named Evaristo Romero, who later renamed himself Aaron Joaquin Gonzalez. He claimed to have received a direct divine calling, not just spiritual inspiration, but a literal visitation instructing him to restore the original apostolic church that had supposedly been lost after the 1st century. From that moment, the role of Apostle of Jesus Christ became the church's supreme authority, a position passed down through the founding bloodline. This is where the theology becomes unusual. La Luz del Mundo teaches that salvation itself flows through the living apostle, not through scripture alone, not through personal faith alone, but through the specific individual holding that title. The apostle is considered God's sole representative on earth, essentially a living conduit between humanity and the divine. Members are taught that rejecting the apostle means rejecting God entirely. The church's headquarters in Guadalajara, a neighborhood called Hermosa Provincia, functions almost like a sovereign territory. It is a walled colony where devoted members live in close proximity to the church leadership, largely insulated from outside culture. Outsiders describe it as deeply insular. Former members describe something closer to total social immersion, where leaving the faith means losing your entire community, family structure, and social identity simultaneously. For decades, La Luz del Mundo wielded enormous political influence in Mexico. Mexican presidents have openly courted the church's leadership due to the sheer voting bloc they represent. That influence made the organization largely untouchable for a long time. That changed dramatically in 2019, when the third apostle, Nason Joaquin Garcia, was arrested in Los Angeles on charges that included human trafficking and the exploitation of minors. The case involved dozens of alleged victims and accusations that church leaders had used the theology of apostolic obedience to coerce members into compliance. the idea being that refusing the apostle carried spiritual consequences severe enough that followers would not resist. In 2022, Nason Joaquin Garcia pleaded guilty to 3 felony counts and was sentenced to 16.5 years in prison. The church, for its part, maintained his innocence publicly and continues to operate with millions of active followers. Many members view the prosecution as a coordinated attack against their faith rather than a legitimate legal proceeding. La Luz del Mundo sits at a genuinely uncomfortable intersection of institutional religion, authoritarian structure, and concentrated personal power. It is not a fringe group operating in the shadows. It is a massive, politically connected institution with a physical capital city, its own internal culture, and a theological framework that places one man's authority above all outside scrutiny. This entry, Ajivika, covers one of history's most extreme fatalistic religions that managed to completely vanish despite lasting nearly 2,000 years. Founded in India around the 5th century BCE by a man named Makali Gosala, the Ajivika religion taught something radical for its time: absolute determinism, not the watered-down version where some things are fated. Every thought, action, and decision you'd ever make was already locked in stone before you were born. Free will didn't exist. You couldn't choose to be good or evil, successful or poor, saved or condemned. The universe had already decided. Makali Gosala was actually a contemporary and former disciple of Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. The two had a falling out over this exact issue. While Jainism taught that your actions determined your karma, Gosala argued that karma itself was predetermined. You couldn't work toward enlightenment because whether you'd achieve it was already decided from the beginning of time. The Ajivikas took this philosophy to its logical extreme. If everything is predetermined, then moral codes become somewhat pointless. This led to them being labeled as nihilists by Buddhist and Jain texts, though that characterization might be unfair given those sources were written by their religious competitors. What we do know is they practiced severe asceticism, wandering naked and subjecting themselves to intense physical hardships, not to earn salvation, but because that's what fate had determined they would do. Despite believing nothing mattered because everything was fixed, they developed complex astronomical and mathematical systems to calculate the exact predetermined length of the universe's cycles. They claimed to know precisely how many cosmic ages would pass before all souls completed their predetermined journeys through every possible form of existence. The religion attracted significant followings, especially under the Mauryan Emperor Bindusara around 298 BCE, who apparently favored them over Buddhists and Jains. They built cave temples, established monasteries, and maintained a presence across India for centuries. Then they disappeared. By the 14th century CE, Ajivika had completely died out. No living practitioners, no continuous tradition, just references in other religions' texts and a few archaeological sites. We only know about their beliefs through the writings of their opponents, which makes reconstructing their actual philosophy challenging. It's entirely possible the Buddhists and Jains who documented them got it wrong or exaggerated the nihilistic aspects. The irony isn't lost on historians. A religion teaching that everything is predetermined somehow couldn't foresee or prevent its own total extinction. Luba Mythology comes from the Luba people of the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the largest and most historically significant ethnic groups in Central Africa. Their belief system is ancient, intricate, and in many ways far more structured than outsiders have given it credit for. At the center of Luba cosmology is a supreme creator deity called Vidyamukulu, sometimes translated as the Great Spirit of the Ancestors. Unlike many creator gods who set the world in motion and step back, Vidyamukulu remains woven into daily life through a layered hierarchy of spirits, nature forces, and ancestral beings that interact constantly with the living. The Luba worldview does not draw a hard line between the sacred and the mundane. Everything from rivers to illnesses to political power carries spiritual weight. One of the most fascinating aspects of Luba belief is the concept of Bulapwe, which refers to divine kingship. Luba rulers were not simply political leaders. They were considered sacred vessels, direct conduits between the human world and the spirit world. The king's body itself was thought to hold mystical energy that could sustain or destabilize the kingdom. If a ruler became ill or weak, it was interpreted as a sign of cosmic imbalance, not just personal misfortune. This gave rise to some striking practices. Certain kings were reportedly removed from power, and ritually ended when they were deemed too frail to carry the sacred energy any longer. The logic being that a weakened vessel endangered everyone, not just the individual inside it. The Luba also developed an extraordinary memory technology called the Lukasa, a handheld wooden board covered in beads, shells, and carved symbols. On the surface, it looks like a piece of decorative art. In practice, it functioned as a mnemonic device used by memory specialists called Ambudi to encode and recall entire histories, genealogies, mythological narratives, and royal secrets. Only initiated members of the Ambudi society could read a Lukasa correctly, and different readers could draw out different layers of meaning from the same board depending on their level of initiation. This is essentially an encrypted oral archive built into a physical object, centuries before the concept had a name in Western scholarship. Luba mythology also features a rich cast of culture heroes and origin figures. Mbidi Kilauea is one of the most prominent, a mysterious hunter-king figure associated with the moon, and considered a civilizing ancestor who introduced refined social customs, sacred kingship rituals, and proper codes of behavior to the Luba people. His son Kalala Ilunga is credited with founding the Luba Empire itself, and his story reads like a full mythological epic, complete with betrayal, supernatural ability, and a destined rise to power. What separates Luba mythology from many better-known African belief systems is how deeply it is tied to political legitimacy. Myth and governance were inseparable. The stories were not just spiritual narratives, they were constitutional documents in oral form, encoding who had the right to rule, why that right existed, and what obligations came with it. Despite the scale and sophistication of the Luba Empire, which at its height in the 18th and 19th centuries controlled a vast region of Central Africa, their mythology remains relatively obscure in mainstream discourse. Much of what is known today survived through the work of researchers like Mary Nutter Roberts, whose studies of the Lukasa and Ambudi society in the late 20th century helped bring serious academic attention to just how layered this tradition really is. Jupiter Dolichenus is one of those fascinating cracks in the Roman religious world that most people never hear about. A god who started as a local iron-working deity in a small Syrian town, and somehow ended up with shrines stretching from Britain to the Black Sea. The origin point is Dolish, a city in what is now southern Turkey, near the modern city of Gaziantep. The region was famous for its iron deposits, and before the Romans ever arrived, the locals worshipped a Baal-type storm god who stood atop a bull and carried a double-headed axe. When Rome absorbed the area, this deity got a Roman makeover and a new name, but the core identity stayed remarkably intact. What makes the spread of this cult genuinely strange is who carried it. Jupiter Dolichenus became almost exclusively the god of Roman soldiers, particularly officers and veterans. His worship moved through the legions like a chain letter. Wherever a soldier who followed Dolichenus got stationed, Hadrian's Wall, the Rhine frontier, the Danube, a shrine tended to follow. Archaeologists have mapped over 100 known cult sites, and they trace almost perfectly along Roman military supply lines. The iconography is striking and visually unlike anything in mainstream Roman religion. Dolichenus is consistently shown in full Roman military armor, standing on the back of a bull, holding a thunderbolt in one hand and that double-headed axe in the other. His consort, Juno Regina Dolicena, often stands opposite him on a deer or cow. The imagery pulls from at least 3 different religious traditions simultaneously: Roman, Anatolian, and Syrian. Yet it cohered into something soldiers apparently found deeply compelling. There's also a mystery cult dimension that researchers are still piecing together. The surviving inscriptions suggest there were degrees of initiation, ritual communal meals, and a strong brotherhood element, a structure that closely mirrors what we know about Mithraism, which was competing for the same military audience at the same time. The cult peaked hard during the Severan dynasty in the early 200s Common Era, when emperors with Syrian roots sat on the throne and Eastern religious influences were flowing freely into Roman life. Then it collapsed almost as fast as it rose. By the late 3rd century, most Dolichenus shrines had gone silent, and the reasons aren't entirely clear. The economic instability of the crisis of the 3rd century, likely disrupted the military networks that had spread the cult, effectively cutting off its lifeblood. What gets left behind is a god who existed almost entirely within a specific subculture, rose to empire-wide significance through a very deliberate social network, and then vanished so completely that his name barely registers outside of archaeological circles today. Sabazios was a sky and horseman deity originating from ancient Phrygia and Thrace, regions that today make up parts of Turkey and the Balkans. His cult eventually spread across the Greek and Roman world, and what made it stand out was its classification as a mystery religion, meaning its full rituals and deeper teachings were reserved strictly for initiated members. The initiation ritual alone is one of the more striking details on record. Ancient sources describe a rite in which a live snake was passed through the clothing of the initiate, against the skin, as a symbol of divine presence entering the body. The Roman writer Clement of Alexandria documented this practice with visible distaste, framing it as evidence of the cult's dangerous, transgressive nature. Whether taken literally or symbolically, it left an impression on outsiders. Sabazios himself was frequently blended with other major deities, most notably Zeus, Jupiter, and Dionysus, reflecting a common ancient tendency to merge foreign gods with familiar ones. This syncretism gave the cult a kind of theological flexibility that helped it spread across vastly different cultures, while still retaining its distinctly ecstatic, emotionally charged worship style. Loud music, wine, and nighttime ceremonies were central to practice. One of the more tangible pieces of evidence we have for this cult comes in the form of the so-called Hands of Sabazios, elaborate bronze votive hands covered in dense layers of symbolic imagery. Serpents, pine cones, frogs, lizards, and figures of deities are all crammed onto these objects, which were likely used in ritual or displayed at shrines. Dozens of them survive in museums today, and scholars still debate exactly how they were used. The cult also had a complicated relationship with Roman authorities. In 139 BCE, a praetor named Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Hispanus issued an expulsion order targeting followers of Sabazios from the city of Rome, lumping them together with Jewish residents in what appears to have been a broader crackdown on foreign religious influence. This moment is historically significant because it represents one of the earliest documented cases of Roman authorities taking formal action against a mystery cult on the grounds of social disruption. The worship of Sabazios lingered well into the later Roman imperial period, eventually fading as Christianity gained dominance, though certain scholars have pointed to possible overlaps between Sabazios imagery and early Christian iconography, particularly around the use of the raised hand gesture in blessing, which appears in both traditions in strikingly similar forms. The Cult of Trophonius was an ancient Greek mystery religion built around one of the most psychologically brutal oracle experiences in the ancient world. While Delphi gets most of the attention when it comes to Greek prophecy, Trophonius operated on a completely different level, one that left its visitors visibly, permanently changed. Trophonius himself was a semi-divine architect, credited in myth with helping to build the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. According to legend, he was eventually swallowed alive by the earth at a site near Lebedia in Boeotia, central Greece, where he then became an oracle spirit consulted from below the ground. The Greeks had a phrase for someone who looked haunted, pale, and unable to smile. They said he had visited Trophonius. That should tell you everything about the reputation this place carried. The process of consulting the oracle was nothing like sitting across from a priestess and asking your question. It was a multi-day ordeal. Seekers would spend several days in a sacred space near the oracle site, following a strict regimen of ritual purification, bathing in the local river, eating only sacrificial meat, and being anointed with oil by attendants called hermai. On the final night, they were brought to two springs and made to drink from both, one called Lethe, meaning forgetting, and one called Mnemosyne, meaning memory. The idea being that you would forget your ordinary life and remember only what the oracle revealed. Then came the descent. The seeker would be dressed in linen robes, fitted with special boots, and then guided to a small opening in the hillside. They would lower themselves feet first into a narrow underground passage, honey cakes in hand, supposedly to appease whatever spirits they encountered below. Many accounts describe being seized by an unseen force and pulled deeper into the darkness, experiencing visions, voices, and what Pausanias, one of our most detailed ancient sources, described as a violent rush of sensation unlike anything in waking life. The Greek writer Pausanias actually documented the entire process in the 2nd century in his work Description of Greece, giving us one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of any ancient mystery rite. He went through it himself. When visitors were pulled back out, assuming they came back at all, they were reportedly unable to laugh for days. Some accounts describe individuals who emerged catatonic or raving. Priests would sit the returning seeker on a special chair called the Throne of Memory and ask them to recount what they had seen while their mind was still in that altered state. The experience was so consistently destabilizing that the sanctuary developed an entire support system just for the aftermath. What makes this cult particularly fascinating from a historical standpoint is the location. The oracle site at Lebedea sat over natural cave formations, and researchers have speculated that the underground passages may have produced hallucinogenic gases, disorienting sensory deprivation, or both, similar to theories about the oracle at Delphi and its geological fissures. The narrow passage, the darkness, the sleep deprivation from the preparatory days, and the psychological priming through ritual would have created a genuinely altered mental state without any additional help. The cult persisted well into the Roman period and retained its fearsome reputation throughout. It was never a popular tourist oracle the way Delphi was. Visiting Trophonius was something you did when you were desperate for an answer, and you accepted that the price of that answer was a piece of your peace of mind. Kejawen is a spiritual belief system rooted in the island of Java, Indonesia, and it is one of the more quietly influential yet rarely discussed traditions in the world. While it draws from Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and animism, Kejawen is not simply a blend of those things. It is its own living system, built around a concept called Sangkan Paraning Dumadi, the idea that all existence flows from a single divine source and will ultimately return to it. The goal of a Kejawen practitioner is not salvation in the conventional religious sense, but a state of inner harmony called slamet, and a deeper union with the divine called Manunggaling Kawulagusti, meaning the merging of the self with God. What sets Kejawen apart is how it handles the invisible world. Practitioners believe Java itself is spiritually active. Its volcanoes, rivers, forests, and coastlines are inhabited by powerful spirits called Danyang, each one acting as a kind of guardian over a specific place. The most famous of these is Ni Roro Kidul, the Queen of the Southern Sea, who is said to rule over the Indian Ocean from her underwater palace. She is not a minor folk figure. Javanese royalty, particularly the sultans of Yogyakarta, have maintained a ritual relationship with her for centuries. There is a dedicated chamber in the Kraton Palace specifically reserved for her visits, and offerings are still made to her to this day. The royal connection runs deep throughout Kejawen. The Javanese concept of wahyu describes a divine radiance or mandate that descends upon a chosen ruler, legitimizing their authority not through law or bloodline alone, but through spiritual selection. Losing one's wahyu was considered a real and serious crisis, a sign that a ruler's time was ending, often accompanied by natural disasters or social unrest interpreted as cosmic confirmation. Kejawen also places enormous weight on Javanese numerology and the traditional calendar system, which runs 2 simultaneous weekly cycles, a 7-day week and a 5-day week called the Pasaran, together forming a 35-day cycle. Each combination of days carries its own spiritual character and is consulted for everything from marriages and business openings to medical decisions and the timing of rituals. This is not a fringe practice. Millions of Javanese people, including many who also identify as Muslim, still observe it. That dual identity is one of the more fascinating tensions within Kejawen. The majority of its practitioners call themselves Muslim, yet the practices often fall far outside Orthodox Islamic teaching. The Dutch colonial administration noted this with frustration in the 19th century, and hardline Islamic reformers in modern Indonesia have repeatedly attempted to label Kejawen as heretical or incompatible with the faith. The tradition has survived all of it. Central to the practice is a form of meditation called semedi, used to commune with spirits, receive divine guidance, or accumulate a kind of spiritual power known as kasekten. Certain individuals called dukun act as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds, performing healing, protective rituals, and occasionally what practitioners describe as spiritual combat. These are not fringe figures in rural villages alone. Documented accounts from the 20th century place Dukun as trusted advisors to military officers and government officials at the highest levels of Indonesian power. The deeper layers of Kejawen include texts called Primbon, personal almanacs that combine astrological data, dream interpretation, numerology, and ritual instructions into a single reference used to navigate major life decisions. Some Primbon manuscripts date back centuries and are treated as sacred objects in their own right. Kejawen is striking in the broader context of world religions is how successfully it has resisted erasure. Colonialism, forced conversion, political suppression under the New Order regime of Suharto, who, notably, was himself a practitioner, and ongoing pressure from religious orthodoxy have all failed to dismantle it. It remains one of the most enduring examples of a syncretic spiritual tradition that continues to shape the politics, culture, and daily life of one of the most populous regions on Earth. Maasai folk religion is the traditional spiritual system of the Maasai people, a semi-nomadic group spread across Kenya and Tanzania, and it is one of the more quietly fascinating indigenous belief systems still actively practiced on the African continent today. At its core, the Maasai believe in a single god called Enkai, sometimes spelled Ngai, a divine being understood to exist in two distinct forms. One form is Enkai Narok, meaning black god, associated with benevolence, rain, and abundance. The other is Enkai Nanyoki, the red god, associated with punishment and drought. This is not a battle between good and evil in the way Western audiences might picture it. Rather, it is the same deity expressing different moods depending on how well humanity has upheld its end of the cosmic bargain. And that bargain is specific. The Maasai believe that Enkai gave all the cattle in the world to the Maasai people at the beginning of time. This is not just a cultural boast, it forms the theological backbone of their entire society. Cattle are sacred, wealth is measured in cattle, and raiding cattle from neighboring groups has historically been considered not theft, but reclamation of what was rightfully theirs by divine decree. You can imagine how that went over with their neighbors. The spiritual intermediary between Enkai and the people is the Laibon, a hereditary figure who functions as a combination of priest, healer, and prophet. The Laibon does not lead military raids or govern in a political sense, but their blessing is considered essential before any major undertaking. The most famous Laibon in recorded history is Mbatian, who led the Maasai through the catastrophic period of the 1890s, a stretch of years that brought rinderpest, smallpox, and severe drought simultaneously. Mbatian reportedly prophesied the coming of a long snake before European railways arrived in East Africa, a detail that has been cited repeatedly as evidence of genuine prophetic ability by those who study the tradition. Ritual life for the Maasai is organized heavily around a system of age sets, called Ilkiama, which move through stages from boyhood to junior warrior to elder. Each transition involves ceremony, and the spiritual dimension of these ceremonies is inseparable from the social one. The most well-known of these is the Unoto ceremony, where young warriors, known as Ilmaran, shave their long ochre-stained hair and transition into senior warrior status. It marks not just a social change, but a shift in one's relationship with Enkai, and with the community's spiritual obligations. The Maasai also maintain a strong belief in the spiritual power of nature itself. Mountains, particularly Oldoinyo Lengai in northern Tanzania, hold deep sacred significance. Oldoinyo Lengai translates directly to Mountain of God, and it remains an active volcano. The fact that it periodically erupts has only reinforced its status as a place where Enkai makes his presence known in an unmistakable way. Despite over a century of pressure from Christian missionaries and significant conversion rates in some regions, the core of Maasai folk religion has shown remarkable durability. Many Maasai today practice a blended faith, holding Christian beliefs alongside the older traditions without seeing a contradiction, which puts them in company with a long list of cultures across the world who found that new religion and old spirituality are not mutually exclusive. Enkai, it seems, is patient. Papuan mythology is one of the most fragmented and least documented belief systems on Earth, and that's largely by circumstance. Papua New Guinea is home to over 800 distinct languages, making it the most linguistically diverse nation in the world. That diversity extends directly into its spiritual traditions, meaning there is no single unified Papuan mythology. There are hundreds of them, many of which were never written down and exist only in oral tradition passed between generations in isolated villages. What binds many of these traditions together are certain recurring themes that appear across different groups with little contact between them. Chief among these is the concept of spirit beings tied directly to the natural world. Mountains, rivers, and forests are not just landscapes, but inhabited by powerful entities that require respect, ritual, and in many cases, appeasement. One of the most well-documented figures across multiple Papuan traditions is the Dema, a primordial being whose death is what gives rise to the world as it exists. The Dema doesn't just die, it is typically sacrificed or killed, and from its body grows the food that sustains humanity. This places violence at the center of creation itself, not as something evil, but as a necessary and sacred act. The anthropologist Adolf Ellegard Jensen spent considerable time studying these traditions in the mid-20th century and identified the Dema deity concept as central to what he called archaic horticulturalists, early farming societies who built their spiritual lives around cultivation and the death and renewal cycle of crops. The Marind Unum people of southern Papua are perhaps the most studied group in this context. Their mythology centers on the Dema as ancestral spirits who existed before humans and whose actions during a mythic time shaped the present world. Crucially, the Marind Anum held elaborate ritual ceremonies tied to these beliefs, some of which involved practices that horrified Western missionaries and colonial administrators who encountered them in the early 20th century. These ceremonies were attempts to ritually reenact the mythic time of the Dema, to literally bring that sacred period back into contact with the present. Another recurring element across Papuan traditions is the cargo worldview, which predates and feeds into the more famous cargo cult phenomenon. Many Papuan groups believed that material abundance, food, tools, wealth, had a spiritual origin and could be accessed through correct ritual behavior. When European goods began arriving in large quantities through colonial trade, this existing framework made sense of it in spiritual terms rather than economic ones, which is exactly how cargo cults emerged. The Huli people of the highland region carry their own distinct mythological tradition centered on Ibagia, a sky world above the physical one, populated by beings called Dama, who interact with humans through dreams and trance states. Huli ritual specialists, known as Huli wigmen, named for their elaborate wigs made from their own hair, served as intermediaries between these worlds. The wig itself was a sacred object, grown out over years and shaped into a specific form that reflected spiritual status. What makes Papuan mythology particularly difficult to catalog is the secrecy built into many of these systems. Certain knowledge was deliberately restricted by gender, age, or initiation level. Men's houses in many Papuan cultures held sacred flutes or carved objects that women were forbidden from seeing, under threat of severe consequences. The knowledge attached to these objects was similarly compartmentalized. Researchers in the 20th century often found that different members of the same community would give contradictory accounts of the same myth, not out of confusion, but because they were each only permitted to know their portion of it. That layered, restricted nature of Papuan spiritual knowledge means that even today, the full picture remains genuinely out of reach. Urianism is one of those religions that takes the approach of, why pick one faith when you can have all of them? Though that description doesn't quite do it justice. Founded in 1993, Urianism is a syncretic, monotheistic, and mystical religion that draws from Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Gnosticism, and ancient mystery schools like Mithraism and Orphism. Its followers, called Urians, which literally translates to from heavenists, believe that God is a singular entity who has simply revealed himself throughout history wearing different masks. Figures like Anu, Yahweh, Allah, and even the Sumerian sky god are all considered the same divine presence, viewed from different cultural lenses across time. The religion was built around a sacred text called the Elyon, also known as the Ahye, which is said to have been channeled and transcribed by a human scribe known as Uria, following a series of near-death experiences, divine visions, and automatic writing sessions that began in 1993. The text itself spans hundreds of paragraphs, covering everything from monotheism and mysticism to ecology, and the goal of eventually establishing a global Urian empire. That last part is, understandably, a talking point. One of the more striking elements of Urian theology is its view on the afterlife. Rather than a singular heaven or hell, Urians believe in a place called Prismia, referred to as the prism plane, or the mansion of Uriel. This is described as a dimension where dreams, fiction, and imagination are literally made real. The idea goes further by proposing that each major monotheistic religion gets its own separate heavenly realm governed by its own corresponding archangel, and that souls reside there between cycles of reincarnation. Reincarnation is something Urianism frames not as a blessing but as a trap. The entire spiritual goal of a Urian is to break free from the cycle of rebirth altogether. Followers are required to practice 7 daily devotions to build a direct personal relationship with both God and their own spirit, which is treated as a distinct part of the self. The religion also incorporates what it calls holy magic, or theurgy, a practice of ritualistic divine magic performed by an ordained Urian priesthood. Mainstream religious institutions have been less than enthusiastic about this particular feature. The founder's belief system took a notable turn in 2005 after he underwent something described as a rite of death and resurrection, a ritual that reportedly brought him to the brink of death and fundamentally changed the direction of the religion's teachings. Earlier texts like the Zyana from 2005 to 2010 were described as considerably harsher in tone, later being replaced with a more moderate framework. Perhaps one of the more unusual claims from Urianism's early period was the founder's conviction that the World Wide Web was the prophesied image of the beast, and that the letters www corresponded to the number 666 through their Hebrew numerical equivalents. He reportedly sent a warning about this to the World Council of Churches before the internet became mainstream. Whether Urianism is a genuine new religious movement or an elaborate philosophical exercise, its scope is difficult to dismiss outright. It attempts to unify not just theology, but cosmology, politics, mysticism, and eschatology under a single framework, and it has been doing so quietly since the early 1990s. The Southeastern Ceremonial Complex is the name given to a vast and poorly understood network of religious practices, symbols, and ritual objects that spread across much of the eastern United States somewhere between 700 and 1600 Common Era. Archaeologists originally called it the Southern Cult, though that label has largely fallen out of favor because it implied a single organized religion, which is almost certainly not what this was. What it actually was is harder to define, and that ambiguity is part of what makes it so fascinating. The complex encompasses dozens of Native American cultures, from the Mississippian mound builders of the interior to coastal peoples along the Gulf and Atlantic shores. Despite being separated by hundreds of miles, these groups were producing strikingly similar ceremonial objects, burying their dead with the same kinds of symbolic items, and apparently sharing a set of spiritual beliefs that transcended tribal boundaries. The iconography is where things get genuinely strange. Recurring imagery includes a figure known as the Birdman, a being depicted as part human, part raptor, often shown in a posed warrior stance. There are weeping eyes, hands with eyes embedded in the palms, cross-and-circle motifs, and a cosmic geography dividing the universe into an upper world, a this world, and an underworld. These weren't decorative choices. They appear consistently across copper plates, shell gorgets, ceramic vessels, and engraved bones recovered from ceremonial sites across the entire region. The Birdman figure in particular has drawn enormous scholarly attention. At Cahokia, the massive mound city near present-day St. Louis, Illinois, a burial known as Mound 72 contained a man laid atop a bed of thousands of shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Surrounding him were mass graves, offerings, and what appear to be the remains of sacrificial individuals. Whether this man was a priest, a chief, or something else entirely, he was clearly being treated as a physical embodiment of the Birdman himself. Cahokia is worth pausing on. At its peak around 1100 Common Era, it was home to an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the pre-Columbian Americas. Its central structure, Monk's Mound, is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The city was organized around massive public plazas, and aligned with astronomical events, particularly the solstices. The scale of the place alone suggests a level of centralized religious authority that archaeologists are still trying to fully account for. The copper trade is another thread worth pulling. Ceremonial copper objects associated with the complex have been found far outside the Mississippi Valley, turning up in places like Florida, Georgia, and the Ohio River region. This wasn't purely economic exchange. Copper, in this context, carried deep spiritual weight associated with the upper world, the sun, and divine power. The fact that these objects moved across such vast distances points to something more like a pilgrimage network or a shared religious economy than simple trade. One of the more provocative theories surrounding the complex is whether it spread through active missionary activity, or whether it emerged somewhat independently across multiple cultures responding to shared cosmological ideas. The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. The absence of a written record means researchers are working almost entirely from material culture, burial practices, and comparative mythology. What is clear is that when European contact disrupted these societies in the 1500s, the complex began to fragment rapidly. Diseases, warfare, and forced displacement shattered the population centers that had sustained it. Some researchers argue that echoes of the complex survive in the ceremonial traditions of later southeastern tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Muskogee, though drawing direct lines is complicated by centuries of upheaval. The southeastern ceremonial complex represents one of the largest and most sophisticated religious traditions to have flourished in North America, and it remains only partially understood. Given how little survives and how recently serious academic attention has been paid to it, there is almost certainly more buried in the ground and more to be learned than current scholarship reflects. Taino mythology is the spiritual and cosmological belief system of the Taino people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean islands who were among the first to encounter Christopher Columbus when he arrived in 1492. The Taino were not a small or scattered group. At their peak, they numbered in the hundreds of thousands across Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. Their mythology was deeply sophisticated, and much of what we know about it survives only in fragments, preserved through early Spanish colonial records and the oral traditions of communities who fought to keep it alive. At the center of Taino belief was a supreme creator figure called Yukahu, whose full name, Yukahu Maorokoti, roughly translates to Spirit of Cassava and the Sea. Cassava was the cornerstone crop of Taino survival, so tying their highest deity directly to it tells you a lot about how their spirituality was grounded in the physical world around them. His counterpart was Arabe, the goddess of fresh water, fertility, and the moon, and she is considered his mother, one of the earliest recorded examples in the Americas of a divine feminine figure sitting at the very top of a cosmological hierarchy. The Taino understood the universe as being shaped by two opposing forces: Huracan, the god of chaos, wind and storms, and the more ordered, life-giving powers associated with Yukahu. That word, Huracan, is where the English word hurricane directly comes from. Every time a meteorologist says it on the evening news, they are unknowingly invoking a Taino deity. Central to Taino religious practice was the concept of zemis. These were sacred objects and spiritual entities simultaneously. A zemi could be a carved stone figure, a wooden idol, a shell, even a human skull, and each one was believed to house a living spiritual force. Taino priests, called bohiques, acted as intermediaries between the community and these spirits, conducting rituals that often involved a ceremonial inhaled powder called cohoba, derived from the seeds of the Anadenanthera peregrina tree. Participants would use a forked inhaler to draw the powder through their nostrils, inducing powerful visions they believed were direct communication with the Zemi world. The Taino creation story describes humanity emerging from caves. Two caves in particular, Katsibajagua and Amaya-Una, are described in their oral tradition as the birthplace of people. The sun and moon also emerged from caves, according to their cosmology. It paints a picture of a people who saw the earth itself as a kind of womb from which all things were born. One of the most haunting aspects of Taino mythology is how abruptly it was nearly erased. Within 50 years of Columbus's arrival, the Taino population of Hispaniola alone had collapsed from an estimated several hundred thousand to just a few thousand due to disease, forced labor, and violence. Spanish missionaries worked systematically to destroy Zemi figures and suppress traditional ceremonies, viewing them as tools of the devil. For a long time, the Taino were even declared culturally extinct by mainstream historians. That classification has since been challenged and rejected by communities in Puerto Rico and the broader Caribbean who have maintained Taino heritage, language fragments, and spiritual practices through generations of careful preservation. DNA studies conducted in the 2000s confirmed what these communities had been saying all along. Taino ancestry is present and measurable in a significant portion of modern Caribbean populations. The mythology never fully died. It just went underground for a few centuries. Umoto is a Japanese religious movement that began in 1892 under circumstances that were, to put it mildly, difficult to ignore. Its founder, Nao Deguchi, was an illiterate peasant woman living in poverty when she claimed to be suddenly and forcefully possessed by a deity known as Ushitora no Konjin, a god associated with the northeast direction, traditionally considered an unlucky quarter in Japanese cosmology. She began writing divine messages by hand, scratching out thousands of pages of scripture despite having almost no formal education. The writings were dense, apocalyptic, and deeply concerned with the idea of Yonaoshi, a complete renewal and reconstruction of the world. The movement might have remained a local curiosity if not for Nao's son-in-law, Onisaburo Deguchi, who became the co-founder and the face that history remembers most vividly. Onisaburo was a figure of almost absurd scale. He claimed direct divine authority, wore elaborate theatrical costumes, produced tens of thousands of pieces of artwork ranging from ceramics to poetry, and dictated an 8-volume spiritual epic called the Reikai Monogatari, or Tales of the Spirit World, which he claimed came directly from his travels through the spiritual realm during a trance state. He also, at one point, led a private military expedition into Mongolia, with the goal of establishing a new spiritual kingdom on Earth. That adventure ended with his capture and a near execution. The Japanese government was not enthusiastic about Umoto. The movement was suppressed twice, once in 1921 and again in 1935, with the second crackdown being particularly severe. Authorities demolished the group's sacred buildings at their headquarters in Ayabe and Kamioka, arrested Onisaburo, and charged the leadership with lese majeste, which was essentially the crime of insulting the emperor. The physical destruction of their holy sites was deliberate and thorough. One of the more remarkable threads connecting Umoto to the outside world is its direct influence on the martial art of Aikido. Morihei Ueshiba, the man who developed Aikido into the system practiced worldwide today, was a devoted follower of Onisaburo Deguchi. He trained under him, accompanied him on the Mongolian expedition, and credited Umoto's spiritual framework as foundational to Aikido's philosophy of harmony and non-resistance. Without Umoto, Aikido as we know it very likely does not exist. Umoto also became one of the earliest Japanese religious groups to formally embrace Esperanto, the constructed international language, as a vehicle for world unity, a cause they promoted actively through publications and missionary efforts. They even established formal ties with the Baha'i faith, recognizing it as a kindred movement working toward universal brotherhood. The religion still exists today, based out of Kamioka in Kyoto Prefecture. Though it operates at a fraction of the scale it once did, it remains one of the more genuinely unusual examples of a new religious movement that shaped martial arts traditions, influenced multiple splinter religions, including Seicho no Ie and Sekai Kyusei Kyo, and managed to antagonize an entire government enough to be dismantled twice and still survive. Konkokyo is one of Japan's most quietly fascinating new religious movements, and its origin story alone is enough to make you do a double take. It was founded in the mid-1800s by a farmer named Kawate Bunkichi, born in 1814 in Okayama Prefecture. His life was marked by a brutal string of tragedies, the deaths of livestock, family members, and his own recurring illnesses. According to traditional Shinto belief at the time, these disasters were the work of Konjin, a notoriously dangerous and malevolent deity associated with certain directions and calendar days. Angering Konjin, even accidentally, was considered a serious spiritual threat. He was essentially the deity people tried very hard to avoid. Kawate disagreed with that interpretation entirely. Rather than fearing Konjin, Kawate claimed to have entered into direct communication with the deity, and found something completely different on the other side. Not a wrathful spirit, but a deeply compassionate, parent-like god. He reframed Konjin entirely, renaming him Tenchi Kane no Kami, meaning roughly, the golden spirit of heaven and earth. In Kawate's view, the suffering people attributed to Konjin was not punishment, but the result of humans and God being out of harmony with each other, and that harmony could be restored. This became the theological core of Konkokyo. The religion centers on the idea that humans and the divine exist in a mutually dependent relationship. God needs humans to flourish, just as humans need God. A strikingly reciprocal concept that sets it apart from most religious frameworks where the relationship flows largely in one direction. The most distinctive practice in Konkokyo is something called toritsugi, which translates roughly to mediation or divine intermediary work. A designated practitioner sits between the worshipper and the divine, facilitating direct communication. There are no elaborate rituals, no priestly hierarchies performing distant ceremonies, just this intimate, almost conversational model of connecting with the sacred. Kawate himself spent his later years almost entirely dedicated to performing toritsugi, reportedly sitting in mediation from early morning until late at night, sometimes seeing hundreds of people in a single day. Kawate was eventually given the religious name Konko Daijin, meaning golden light, and after his death in 1883, the movement he started continued to grow. It was officially recognized as an independent Shinto-derived religion in 1900, which gave it legal standing separate from state Shinto structures, a meaningful distinction in Meiji-era Japan. Today, Konkokyo maintains churches not just in Japan, but in several countries including the United States and Brazil, largely through Japanese diaspora communities. Its teachings remain focused on this worldly harmony rather than elaborate afterlife doctrines, and the toritsugi practice is still actively performed in Konkokyo churches to this day. The legacy of Kawate Bunkichi is essentially the story of a man who looked at one of the most feared figures in his religious tradition and decided everyone had it wrong, and somehow convinced enough people to build a living religion around that conviction. Zenrinkyo is a Shinto-based Japanese new religion, officially known as Zenrinkyo, or in its written form, the characters for Good Neighbor Teaching. It was founded in 1947 by a man named Rikihisa Tatsusai, initially under the name Tenchi Kodo Zenrinkai, and its headquarters sit in Fukuoka Prefecture in southern Japan. By the mid-1990s, it claimed a nominal membership of around 450,000 people. To understand where it came from, you have to look at the father first. Rikihisa Tatsusaburo, the founder's father, was already a recognized religious figure and spiritual medium before his son carried things forward. But the detail that stands out is that he reportedly worked as a spiritual medium on behalf of both police and government officials. That's not a metaphor. He was consulted in an official, or at least semi-official, capacity. When he died in 1926, his son Tatsusai inherited both the religious organization and apparently that same role. A ghost whisperer for hire arrangement, passed down like a family business. Tatsusai then relocated to Seoul, then known by its Japanese colonial name, Keijo, where he lived and worked from 1929 all the way through 1938. During that time, the experience he would later describe as the most formative of his spiritual life took place. A 4-year solitary training period inside a cave deep within what is now Bukhansan National Park in South Korea. That cave is known today among Zenrinkyo followers simply as the Cave of Bats. The fact that the spiritual heart of a Japanese Shinto-derived religion is located in a South Korean national park is something worth sitting with. 2 other sacred sites, referred to in the tradition as Oyukiba, which roughly translates to sacred training grounds, are also within the same park. These are called Elephant Rock and Dragon Rock. So while the organization is headquartered in Japan, its holiest physical locations are all on Korean soil, which gives the movement an unusual cross-national character that most Japanese new religions don't share. The group's scriptures include titles like The Garden of Zenrin, The Book of Heaven, and The Way of Being Towards God, and leadership follows a bloodline succession model common to many Japanese new religions of this type. When one leader dies, a blood relative takes over. Zenrinkyo expanded into South Korea officially in 1971 when Tatsusai made a formal visit to Seoul. The South Korean branch is currently located in the Hongjae-dong area of Seoul's Seodamun district, not far from the very mountain range where the religion's founding spiritual experiences took place. There's something almost deliberately circular about that. Nova Roma is an organization founded in 1998 with a genuinely ambitious goal: the full reconstruction of ancient Roman civilization, not as a historical reenactment hobby, but as a functioning modern state with its own government, religion, and legal framework. The founders, Flavius Vettius Germanicus and Quintus Marcius Philippus, established Nova Roma as an incorporated entity in the state of Maine, giving it a real legal footprint while simultaneously operating as what they called a res publica, a republic, modeled directly on pre-imperial Rome. At its core, Nova Roma is a religious project as much as a political one. The state religion is the Religio Romana, the traditional polytheistic faith of ancient Rome, centered on the worship of the Capitoline Triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, alongside the broader Roman pantheon. Members are expected to participate in the ancient Roman sacred calendar, observing festivals like the Lupercalia and the Parentalia, which is a festival honoring dead ancestors. Priests called flamines are appointed to serve specific deities, and the organization maintains a functioning Pontifex Maximus, the same title later adopted by the Catholic Pope. The civic structure mirrors the Roman Republic almost exactly. There are elected consuls, a senate, and even censors who manage the roles of citizens. At its peak, Nova Roma claimed citizens in dozens of countries, all assigned to Roman-style tribes and voting centuries. Where things get complicated is the internal politics. Nova Roma has been rocked repeatedly by bitter power struggles, schisms, and legal battles that, ironically, mirror the kind of factional chaos that tore apart the actual Roman Republic. At various points, rival factions have claimed to be the legitimate government. Senators have been expelled and counter-expelled, and the whole enterprise has come dangerously close to collapse more than once. A major split in the mid-2000s led to the formation of rival organizations, each claiming to be the true heir to the Nova Roman project. The original organization survived but never quite recaptured the momentum of its early years. What makes Nova Roma genuinely worth paying attention to, beyond the spectacle of it all, is that it represents one of the more serious attempts at reconstructionist paganism embedded inside a functioning civic structure. It isn't just people dressing up in togas on weekends. The theological work put into reconstructing Roman religious practice is taken seriously by scholars of ancient religion, even if the political theater surrounding it tends to overshadow that work entirely. The native Polish church, known in Polish as the Rodzymi Kościół Polski, is one of the oldest continuously existing Slavic neo-pagan organizations in the world, and its history is far stranger and more turbulent than its relatively quiet modern presence might suggest. Founded in 1921 by Władysław Kołodziej, it predates the broader modern pagan revival by decades. The church centers on the reconstruction of pre-Christian Slavic religion, venerating a pantheon of gods including Perun, the god of thunder and storms, and Swarodzik, a solar deity associated with fire and the forge. These are not fringe mythological figures within Slavic tradition. They are the closest equivalents the region has to Zeus or Thor, figures who commanded genuine widespread worship before Christianity swept through Eastern Europe and effectively buried them. What makes the church's story particularly striking is its survival record. It was suppressed under Nazi occupation during World War II, then again under the communist regime in post-war Poland, which had little tolerance for ethno-religious movements operating outside the state's ideological framework. The organization went underground, fragmented, and in many respects had to rebuild from near nothing after communism collapsed in 1989. That revival brought complications. Slavic neo-paganism as a broader movement has, in various corners of Europe, attracted individuals drawn more to ethnic identity politics than to genuine spiritual reconstruction. The native Polish church has worked to position itself as a religious institution rather than a political one, but the line between ethnic heritage, cultural identity, and nationalist ideology gets blurry in this space, and the church has not been entirely immune to that tension. Their ritual calendar follows the old agricultural and astronomical cycles, with celebrations tied to solstices, equinoxes, and seasonal transitions that predate any Christian influence on the region. These observances are called Słowiańskie Święta, or Slavic Holy Days, and they draw on fragmentary historical sources, folk traditions, and a fair amount of careful reconstruction, since the Christianization of Poland in 966 AD was thorough enough to erase or absorb most of what came before it. The church remains small but legally recognized in Poland, which itself is a notable achievement given how dominant Roman Catholicism is in Polish cultural and political life. Practicing pre-Christian Slavic religion openly in one of the most Catholic nations in Europe is not exactly an easy path, and the fact that this institution has existed in some form for over a century speaks to a persistent thread of indigenous religious identity that never fully disappeared. Fraternitas Saturni translates to the Brotherhood of Saturn, and this German occult lodge has maintained one of the most openly Luciferian practices in Western esotericism since 1926. Founded by Eugen Grosche, who went by the magical name Gregorius, this order emerged from a split with Aleister Crowley's Thelemic movement after disagreements over magical philosophy. The group centers their entire system around Saturn as both planet and deity, viewing this celestial body as the key to unlocking forbidden knowledge and personal transformation. Unlike other occult orders that dance around darker themes, the Fraternitas Saturni embraces what they call the Saturnian current directly, incorporating explicit Luciferian symbolism into their rituals and teachings. Their magical system operates through 33 degrees of initiation, each corresponding to different aspects of Saturnian influence. Members progress through increasingly complex practices involving astrology, sex magic, and what they term electrical magic, a unique blend of occult theory with early 20th century scientific concepts about electromagnetic forces. What kept this order particularly controversial was their survival through Nazi Germany, when most occult groups faced persecution or dissolution. The Fraternitas Saturni managed to continue operating underground, with some members allegedly maintaining connections to German intelligence networks, though the exact nature of these relationships remains disputed among researchers. The lodge produced extensive written materials, including their primary text, Saturn Gnosis, which outlines their complete magical system. Modern practitioners still follow Gregorius's original frameworks, making this one of the few occult orders to maintain consistent practices across nearly a century of operation. Today, various splinter groups claim legitimacy as successors to the original Fraternitas Saturni, each maintaining their own interpretation of Saturnian magic, while continuing the order's tradition of deliberate provocation within occult circles. Gaianism transforms our planet from a simple rock floating in space into a conscious, breathing entity that actively manages its own survival. This belief system emerged from scientist James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis in the 1970s, which proposed that Earth functions as a single self-regulating organism. Living beings, the atmosphere, oceans, and soil work together like organs in a body to maintain conditions suitable for life. While Lovelock intended this as a scientific theory, it quickly evolved into something far more mystical. Modern Gaianists take this concept several steps further. They view Earth not just as a self-regulating system, but as a genuinely conscious being with thoughts, emotions, and intentions. Some practitioners claim they can communicate directly with this planetary consciousness through meditation, dreams, or altered states of consciousness. The movement draws heavily from ancient goddess worship traditions, particularly the Greek primordial deity Gaia. Followers often incorporate rituals involving direct contact with Earth, such as burying themselves in soil, consuming clay, or performing ceremonies at specific geological sites they believe hold special energy. Environmental activist and author Starhawk popularized many Gaianist practices in the 1980s and 90s, blending ecological activism with witchcraft and goddess spirituality. Her workshops taught participants to sense the planet's emotional state and respond to environmental crises as personal attacks on a living being. Some Gaianist groups claim that Earth actively selects which species survive or go extinct based on their contribution to planetary health. Under this worldview, natural disasters become the planet's immune response, clearing away harmful elements. Climate change transforms from a human-caused problem into Earth's conscious decision to restructure itself. The more extreme practitioners believe they serve as Earth's nervous system, receiving direct messages about impending geological events or environmental changes. Several Gaianist communities have relocated based on these supposed planetary communications, particularly around fault lines and volcanic regions,